The SWAT team stormed the biker clubhouse, but the Angels were ready for them, a true story. It was about 3 in the morning when the police vehicles started moving. No lights, no sirens. Just a long line of dark trucks rolling quietly through the empty streets of San Bernardino, California. Inside those trucks, 30 heavily armed SWAT officers sat in complete silence. Each one focused, each one ready. They had trained for nights exactly like this one. Their target was a building most people in the neighborhood had learned to ignore over the years. A brick structure, sitting behind a reinforced steel door, with no windows facing the street. A hand-painted sign above the entrance. Old motorcycles parked in a neat line outside, like they were part of the furniture. It was the clubhouse of the Hells Angels, one of the most well-known and closely watched motorcycle clubs in American history, and tonight, law enforcement was convinced they were about to change everything. To understand why this night mattered so much, you have to understand what was going on in America at that time. It was the late 1970s, and federal agencies were under enormous pressure to crack down on organized crime. New laws had given prosecutors powerful tools to go after groups suspected of criminal enterprise. Motorcycle clubs, especially the Hells Angels, were near the top of that list. The government had been building cases, flipping informants, and executing raids across multiple states. The Purdue chapter, the original chapter, the one that had started everything back in 1948, was considered the crown jewel of the whole organization. If you could bring down Purdue, you sent a message to every chapter across the country. So the pressure on the commander and his team that night was real. This was not just another raid. This was supposed to be a defining moment. Months of work, federal resources, and full cross-agency coordination all pointed at that one brick building on that one street. The people who had signed off on this operation expected results. They expected arrests. They expected headlines that would justify every dollar and every hour poured into making it happen. The operation had been planned carefully. Detectives, federal agents, and a special unit from the ATF had been building their case piece by piece over many months. An informant had given them what they believed was solid intelligence. Weapons stored illegally inside the building, evidence of criminal activity, enough to justify a full raid with a signed warrant. The paperwork was done, the plan was locked in. All they needed was the right moment, and now that moment had arrived. Inside the command vehicle, the man leading the operation sat with a map spread across his lap. He had been in law enforcement for over 20 years. He had led raids before. He had walked into dangerous situations more times than he could count. But something about this particular night felt slightly off to him. A small unease he couldn't quite name or explain. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on the job. There was no room for doubt now. 2 miles away, something very different was already happening inside that clubhouse. A telephone had rung earlier that evening. The man who picked it up was the chapter president. A quiet, sharp man, the other members simply called Stick. He had been around long enough to know how these things worked. He had survived federal investigations before. He had watched other chapters get raided and seen the aftermath play out in courtrooms, newspapers, and worried late-night phone calls. When he heard the voice on the other end of that phone, he didn't panic. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded slowly, thanked the caller, and set the receiver down gently on the table. Then he walked into the main hall and told his sergeant-at-arms, a big, steady man the club knew as Earl, that tonight was the night. Earl had served in the military before joining the club. He had seen real chaos up close, the kind that changes a person permanently. And what he took away from that experience was a single lesson he never forgot. Preparation beats panic every single time. For years, quietly and without drawing attention to it, Earl had been getting the clubhouse ready for exactly this kind of moment. Not by hiding weapons or doing anything that would deepen the trouble, but by making sure that everything inside those walls was either legally owned, fully documented, or simply not there anymore. In the hours after Stick's phone call, the remaining members arrived one by one. No commotion, no raised voices. They came in, took their seats in the main hall, and waited. Someone put on a pot of coffee. A couple of the older members pulled out books. One man worked quietly on a crossword puzzle near the back wall. By the time the SWAT trucks were rolling through the neighborhood, 32 Hells Angels members were sitting in neat rows inside their own clubhouse, calm, steady, and fully prepared for whatever was about to come through that door. Their attorney had already been called. He was already on his way. At 4:31 in the morning, the ram hit the front door. The sound cracked through the whole block. Flashbang grenades went off in the entry corridor. Standard procedure, designed to disorient anyone caught off guard. Officers flooded through in tight formation, flashlight beams cutting through the smoke, voices shouting commands, boots hitting the concrete hard. The lead officer pushed through the main hall doorway and stopped dead. She stood there for a moment, just taking in what she was seeing. Later, when she was asked to describe it, she said it was the strangest thing she had ever walked into in her entire career. 32 men, seated in rows, hands resting in plain sight, faces completely still, nobody running, nobody shouting, nobody reaching for anything or glancing toward an exit. Just 32 members of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the country, sitting there together like they had quietly agreed to wait for something they had been expecting all along. Earl was in the front row. He looked at the officer and spoke first. His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of someone with nothing to hide, and fully aware of it. He told her that their attorney had already been contacted, that their rights were being exercised, and that they were ready to cooperate fully with any lawful search of the building. On the table in front of Stick sat 3 things: a legal notepad, a pen, and the business card of their attorney. That was it. The officers exchanged looks. The commander moved through the room slowly, trying to read it. This was not what a guilty room looked like. This was not the energy of men who had been caught by surprise. This was something else, controlled and deliberate, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he already felt the night beginning to slip away from him. For the next 2.5 hours, officers went through every room in the building. They checked walls, storage areas, ceiling panels, every corner they could access. The attorney arrived around 5 in the morning, and from the moment he stepped through the door, he began documenting everything. Every item disturbed, every room entered, every officer's movement through the property. All of it timed and recorded and written down with care. He wasn't there to cause problems. He was there because his clients had the legal right to have him present, and he intended to use that right fully. What the search turned up was deeply frustrating for the raid team. A couple of hunting rifles, both legally registered, with all the correct paperwork sitting right beside them. Motorcycle parts logged as club inventory with matching receipts. A locked safe that Stick opened himself without being asked, pulling out the key calmly and swinging the door wide, telling the officers there was nothing in there to worry about. Inside the safe, financial records, insurance documents, and a birthday card, signed by more than half the members, made out to the chapter's accountant. What they got instead of a weapons stockpile was 32 men sitting quietly in chairs, 1 pot of coffee, and a birthday card addressed to an accountant. The weapons the informant had described in detail, the items that had formed the entire foundation of the warrant, were nowhere to be found. What nobody outside the club knew was that those items had been moved to a legally registered storage facility several days before the raid, with signed inventory paperwork and proper documentation, everything handled correctly and above board. The informant, it would later come out, had been fed a completely false picture for months, not by accident, deliberately. The club had figured out who was passing information to law enforcement and had spent a long stretch of time carefully managing what that person saw and heard. They had essentially written the script for a raid that would find nothing, make no valid arrests, and leave the agencies involved with a lot of uncomfortable questions to answer. Every step had been thought through long before the first truck left the police lot. By the time the sun came up over San Bernardino, the operation was over in every way that mattered. The commander stood outside the building and made the call. Without sufficient evidence, the decision was made to release the members on the scene. 2 men were briefly detained, not because of anything found in the clubhouse, but because of minor unrelated warrants that had nothing to do with the raid at all. As officers began pulling back, one moment from that night stood out above all the others. One of the younger members had been briefly separated during the search. An officer, nervous and moving too fast, put his hand on the young man's shoulder with more force than the situation called for. Nobody got hurt. But a camera caught it, and the young member responded in a way that caught everyone nearby off guard. He didn't pull away. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at the officer with complete composure and asked, quietly and clearly, for his badge number. He wrote it down, He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He didn't say another word about it. That badge number, along with the camera footage, became the foundation of a civil rights complaint filed the following week, handled through the courts, by the book, exactly as everything else that night had been. As the last police vehicle disappeared around the corner, Stick stood on the front steps in the early morning light and watched it go. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone together. He just stood there for a moment in the quiet, then turned around and walked back inside. In the weeks and months that followed, the fallout was significant, mostly for the agencies involved. A formal legal challenge was filed against the warrant itself, arguing it had been built on intelligence that never truly supported the level of probable cause required. Internal reviews were opened. Questions were raised publicly about how months of undercover work had produced results so completely disconnected from what was actually inside that building. The commander who led the raid retired from the department about 14 months later. In a brief statement before leaving, he said that in all his years of service, that was the night that stayed with him the longest, not because of violence or chaos, but because of how quietly and completely he had been outmaneuvered. Stick led the chapter for another decade. Earl remained the sergeant-at-arms for years afterward. The young member who calmly asked for a badge number eventually became a well-known voice on the legal rights of motorcycle club members across the state. And the clubhouse, it is still standing. The story of that night has been told and retold in law enforcement circles and biker communities alike, not as a story about crime or violence, because there was none, but as a story about what happens when one side walks into a situation completely certain they know what they are going to find, and the other side has spent months carefully making sure there is nothing there to find. The SWAT team had numbers, weapons, full legal authority, and every tactical advantage you could ask for. They had everything, except the one thing that actually decided the outcome of that night. They didn't know what the angels already knew, and in the end, that was the only thing that counted. End of story.